The second piece I want to look at is, is the progression of the experience. Now, obviously, every individual, the experience is going to progress differently. So for me, I recognized that what was happening was that along with this intensity, voices were getting in the way of what I was trying to do. That for me was the most fundamental thing. I was trying to understand what was happening with voices. I left that for a while and actually went back to doing my sort of normal day job, for want of a description, and then came back to it again. And of course, every time I came back to it, voices sort of got in the way. So it was pretty clear voices were trying to undermine what I was doing. So because I recognized that pattern, if you like, that voices were undermining what I was doing, at some point I connected the dots and actually mapped the themes at which voices were very, very busy. And then I could see the relationship between the themes, that voices were very busy about and what I was actually trying to achieve. So I'll show you that in the mind strategies, because that's that one is specific to me. What I've done here is taken that same idea and kind of said, okay, so through my journey of these 10 years, so what are the low points, if you like, that I've experienced, through this journey, and what made them low points? Because actually, I think a lot of them are low points for many others. And if we can actually recognize that there is a journey to this thing, and although my journey is of course unique, there are again structural things about how this phenomenology presents, that it actually presents particular situations and circumstances that many of us will actually experience. And what I want to do is simply say, is kind of point out, not necessarily all of them, but some of them, and say, that was sort of, as I call, tipping points more than sort of turning points. So this was the sort of experience of them. And then what I'll show you is that actually from a process point of view, what was happening was they were actually undermining my reward progression. And so, of course, if I want to actually fix it, that's what I've got to fix. So I started here. So voices, I started hearing voices, out of the blue in about the middle of 2008. So it made absolutely no sense to me. There's no history in the family. I'd had a great life up to that point. There was absolutely no. The fact, the most standout thing about it was that it made no sense. I mean, there was just no idea. As you can hear, I'm struggling to describe it even. There was no idea for me to connect to in terms of why this might actually happen to me. So you've seen my first episode description. So those first 7 or 8 weeks, whatever it was, that led to the panic attack. But the next big thing that actually helped me move forward. So at the top here, I'm actually laying down things that help me move forward. At the bottom here, I'm laying out things, with this red arrow sort of pushing me backwards. These are things that sort of, if you like, got in the way, whereas, where this arrow is representing me getting on with life and actually enjoying it. The first thing that came along that gave me a completely different view, as I mentioned before, was when the doctor described it as auditory hallucinations. So over here, it was the neighbors, which was an unpleasant experience. Once it was described as auditory hallucinations, it was still unpleasant. But what it did for me was it made me think about it completely differently, gave me a new frame of reference, a new language, which is a very, very important piece of what is actually going on. And I think it's actually very, very important what we say to people the first time they encounter help, because that can make a huge difference. And what you want to do is actually say the right things that will satisfy our emotional systems, which is why I was introducing the idea of the emotional systems earlier on. What you want to do is build optimism, confidence, and help people feel more secure. And that's the basics of the conversation that you want to have. Still, for me, this experience, this thing for me was so obviously external, not coming from my brain. That I didn't relate to this term auditory hallucinations, and I say, my reaction to it was, to heck with this, I'm going to fight it. And for me, that was actually also a very, very powerful thing. I think if I'd been along to a psychiatrist who kind of said to me, you'll never work again and you're mentally ill, I would have responded probably completely differently. I don't know, but I think we can figure that out fairly logically. So what happened from there on was that my voices got very, very busy. So it was this combination of, sort of laughing at me and making, getting in the way of my, of my soothe system. So the laughing at me, if you like, was sort of mocking my drive system. I didn't have this language at the time. And the unhappy face was my soothe system was not happy. I couldn't find good outcomes. But actually, this was, a year probably of just this barrage and bombardment by voices. It was this complete and utter confusion. Voices being very, very aggressive, literally all day, every day. I couldn't work. All I did was spend my day bouncing back and forth, with voices, to the point where I developed what I called, I don't think I developed it, it just happened, what I called a one-way tirade. Was that the best way that I could actually blot out what voices were saying was to think at them, for want of another description. So my half of the transmit, I just exaggerated and I just pushed back. Of course, that's exhausting. It's not exactly fulfilling. It's not fun. I don't really know how I survived that first year. So it was just a state of sort of total confusion. Now that I step back, I kind of say this was actually just voices doing their best to undermine me, and of course to confuse. The next big step for me that was actually very, very difficult. So over here in this stage, I just didn't know what to do. As I say, I just reacted and responded, to what was happening. If that had gone on much longer, I would probably have just opted out. It was just made life not worth living. The next step, for me, that was actually very difficult to say was sort of help seeking. And the first of all was the kind of decision to go and seek help. So I first went and spoke to the doctor, and he prescribed antipsychotics for a week. Because I couldn't relate to the description of auditory hallucinations, and that was the professional opinion, I actually decided that actually going back and getting, being told the same thing again, wasn't particularly, going to help me. I did go and speak to, a psychiatrist sort of much later on. I'll get to that sort of in a minute. But what I did do, of course, is do a lot of exploring on my own. And of course, what you find when you do this is that there are so many different opinions out there. So for me, number one, the things I really missed was there was no structure for actually having a pragmatic conversation about what was going on. Nobody that I spoke to had any clue, any understanding, of the experience at all. And everything I read about it was people describing, of course, their individual experiences. So everything you read from psychiatrists, describes, this thing as a chemical imbalance. I mean, for me, just complete nonsense. And even when I came across the kind of hearing voices movement, there were two words that just put me off completely. The whole idea of accepting and living with. There was no way, that I could find a way to accept cruel voices. I could acknowledge that they were there. I certainly couldn't accept them. And I certainly wasn't going to tolerate the idea of living with them. For me, it was just so vile. I would literally, rather not, quite frankly. But so for me, there was actually no way of having a structure. Nobody that I spoke to could describe the phenomenology. Nobody that I spoke to could actually, this is what I mean by no description. Nobody could tell me anything about how to respond to voices. You can go and see a psychiatrist. When you walk out of the office, you're still hearing voices. Nobody's giving you any idea on how to respond. And you have no choice but to respond because voices are engaging your brain and your thoughts are your response. So you're responding anyway, whether you like it or not. Of course, I've since discovered that there are good ways to respond and there are ways that are not so good to respond. And of course, nobody had any insight into that at all. In fact, nobody's even talking about it. I mean, it was that completely off the radar, almost as an option. That's probably not true today. I mean, there's a really recent study, for example, about avatar therapy. And in fact, I believe the first one was nearly 10 years ago. But I certainly didn't come across it until way later, because that stuff is in the researcher's domain. It's actually, it's not even in the domain, of sort of carers, and to say you've got to do an awful lot of work to even, to even discover it. There was no one, sort of there's no projection. There was nobody who was able to kind of say to me, well, this is what you might expect. And if this is what you might expect, then this is what you can do about it. Nobody was able to have that sort of conversation. More than that, what's clear when you sort of explore what's going on out there is that there's a total lack of understanding. Of course, there are some, a fair number of individuals who have found something that works for them, which is great. There aren't many, that are able to describe it in a way, that for the benefit of others is more than trial and error. They can say, I've done this and it works, and that's great. So I can try it and it may or may not work. Okay, it doesn't necessarily add to a real understanding. There's certainly a lot out there, in terms of ideas and techniques, perhaps. Might be a way to kind of, differentiate what I'm getting at here when I'm saying there's no understanding. And then more than that, I had no credibility, because now suddenly I'm suffering from some sort of mental condition. As I say, I didn't get diagnosed as schizophrenic until I went to see a psychiatrist, which was about a year in. But of course, what happens now is, you've behaved strangely, you've had these panic attacks, what's happened to Greg, and of course, others, the beliefs of others are being imposed on you, and quite literally your credibility is undermined. So even, so people actually stop listening to you. It's not much fun at all. And of course, everything you explore, so everything you read, everything you Google and look up, online or what have you, becomes a new bunch of stimuli and ideas for voices to believe, to use to bleep with your mind. And so this is the other thing: is the more I explored, the more material, the more fodder, I gave to voices to badge me with. The more ideas they had to distract me with, the more dead ends they were able to lead me down. So this absence of any kind of clear path is a huge problem, because it is the interaction between what voices say and what you think that is the experience of it. And of course, all of this stuff is actually shaping your thinking in particular ways that are actually not helpful. So of course the experience perpetuates, and that's actually, of course, and then voices are exaggerating that by imposing these stories on you. So, so voices are imposing this stuff on you, number one. And number two, there's nothing out there that's helping you find a way out of it, or very little. And, it's very difficult to come across. It's different, of course, depending where you are. I think if you're in the UK, this is probably not as bad. I was in South Africa and then in the States. And certainly in South Africa, there was, hearing voices movement isn't even represented. Psychiatrists you go and talk to haven't even heard of it. The States is actually doing stuff in that space. I think the UK and Netherlands are certain, and Australia are much sort of further ahead. But nevertheless, is even if you explore those things, there are so many options out there, that you'll end up wading through it. A lot of it, all the research stuff is not in language that's usable, quite frankly. If I've got to sit with a dictionary, to actually read a research article, sometimes, I mean, it's not always the case, but often it's the case. And I'm relatively smart. So a lot of that stuff just isn't accessible for people. So help seeking is actually a very difficult phase. And I think actually the best I've seen currently are the sort of first episode and or early intervention sort of programs, because they actually are an open dialogue. They offer very practical help. So of course what happens is, I say, this conflict is perpetuating. You're getting all these episodes. I say some of them translate to panic and paranoia and blah blah blah. But even some of the smaller ones, I say, for me there are these 100,000 transactions a day. I don't know what the number is, but it's that sort of order that are getting in the way of what I'm trying to do. And of course, what happens is this leads to a feeling of helplessness. So of course, this is a dangerous point, from the point of view of actual risk, is when you've sort of been through this kind of cycle, something new, it's very confusing, nobody understands it, you're not getting sensible help, it's continuing in these episodes, which are hugely unpleasant, really scary and confusing stuff, and you just don't know what to do. So this feeling of helplessness, is a very much a low point, kind of in this exercise. I'm very lucky in that I was able to rely on family and friends, who've been absolutely stunning in terms of supporting me through this process. And when I needed help, it was there. I've had 2 family members, one fly from Joburg to Cape Town. It's a 2-hour flight. One fly from Durban to Cape Town to come and help me when I needed it. In sort of an emergency situation. Not everybody has that. And I've certainly had other friends, that I've relied on in other ways, certainly in panic attacks. And I'm staying with a friend at the moment. So I've been very, very lucky. And so, of course, this is a very, very important piece of it. Another piece for me that actually moved things along was because I was actually trying to understand what was happening, number one. Number two, I was convinced there had to be patterns to voice behavior, not just my voice behavior, because it seemed so random over here. And of course, this was the whole point, was voices were trying literally to confuse me. The first thing that I read that made sense, the first aha thing for me, was I read about bullying. And of course, there is a particular pattern to bullying behavior. And of course, once I read that, I read more. I read about psychopaths and about sociopaths. And really, that's what my voice is of, the sort of combination of bullies, psychopaths, sociopaths. And if you read all the descriptions of behaviors that you can expect in those realms, that's the kind of behavior that my voices exhibit. Because for me, the reason I'm putting that up here was, of course, this was kind of semi-frightening in a way, I was already experiencing it, so I was already being scared by it. But actually being able to put a pattern to it made me, sort of moved me along on my sort of path, if you like, of sort of, understanding. And the second thing, that sort of made a big difference to me was that I actually realized that I was doing better in spite of my voices being particularly cruel. I was doing better than a lot of, well, not a lot, better than the few other people that I knew, around me who heard voices at that stage. There weren't many, there were a couple. But I certainly coped a lot better, and I was obviously doing something different. And what it was is that I was actually using my practice of neurolinguistic programming to respond directly to voices. And all I was doing was I was interrupting it, and I was actually replacing it with something else. So I was interrupting the train of thought and replacing it with something. So I was owning the transaction. And I didn't realize at the time how important that was. And of course, this was the other piece, was I had a pattern for this number 3 over here, that I thought others could very, very easily learn. The next low point for me was, just past this point of helplessness, actually my voice is quieting down at one point. It was actually as a result of this. And I had this period of sort of somewhere between 9 and 12 months of what I describe as mainly tinnitus. So my voice has got very quiet. I had this constant buzz, and I'd get this little burble of voices coming out of it every now and again. And it was still, for me, extremely irritating. And in fact, this is odd enough, this is when I went to a psychiatrist. And for me, it was chronic realization. And I call it that because I kind of said, okay, this thing's not going away. I've done everything I can, and it's still here. It's not going away. Let me go and actually chat to a psychiatrist. And of course, that conversation did absolutely nothing for this. In fact, it aggravated it. Because I was told, actually, take these tablets. If they don't work, we'll try another one. And you're going to take them for the rest of your life. So when I put on 25 kilograms in sort of 9 weeks, and was back for a review at the psychiatrist, I said to him, look at this, I need a whole new wardrobe. And says, well, literally, he shrugged and said, it's a side effect. And of course, at that point, I'm thinking, really? So now I'm going to live with voices for another 30 years or something. In my mind, I'm now 25 kilograms lighter. Don't feel sort of good about myself. None of my clothes fit with me. The meds have dulled my emotions. Really, this is a solution? No, it's not a solution at all. It's actually making it worse. So this for me was another low point that actually was aggravated by going and as I say, seeing a psychiatrist, because actually the tablets made me feel worse. They made me put on weight, a lot of weight, which made me feel worse again. And of course, my emotions were dulled. It was not very exciting at all. The next big thing that happened for me was, after this sort of quiet period, I said my voices were quiet for sort of 9, 12 months, whereas they suddenly came back very suddenly over weekends. Why I call it a surprise attack. And it was literally, I mean, I think voices were monitoring what was going on here, if you like. And they let things get quiet. They waited long enough for me to forget what I was doing here, basically. And they came along, bang, caught me completely by surprise, of course, engaged my threat system. And of course, what happened was I went along to my doctor. I got some tranquilizers. And of course, what happened, while I had the tranquilizers was that my voices attacked me very, very aggressively again, and they escalated the phenomenology. So don't ask me how this happens, don't know. Okay, but what voices did was create this feeling of tension in my abdomen and my chest, and then they ratcheted the tension up, so I could literally feel it physically moving, up my chest with voices making threats at me. Is this what you want to feel like for the rest of eternity? Or like this, a step further, a step more aggressive, a step more threatening, a step more awful in terms of feeling. Or perhaps like this. This is this voice called God, by the way, who is threatening me with these things. Okay, this for me was so bad that I actually just took a bottle of tranquilizers that I had just got because I decided I'm not living with this. It's just not worth it. I mean, quite frankly. And of course, so this would have been a complete surprise to anybody had that been successful. Fortunately, you take a whole bottle of tranquilizers, all that happens is you sleep for 2 days. And I actually woke up okay to discover that I had actually got up in the middle of it and gone off to work. So it's a little funny from that point of view, as a story. But if I'd had other things in the house, I mean, that could have been a completely different point of view. So of course, this is the spiral down towards sort of suicide risk. It's this feeling of helplessness. It's the realization that it's chronic, it's not going away, that actually voices can come back at any time and make it hell for you. And as I say, they can impose this phenomenology as torture on you. So this me was so bad that I just decided, not worth it, I'm out of here. And so this would have been a complete surprise to anybody because I hadn't even been talking about, in fact, I'd been fine, sort of up to here. This was literally just the weekend, and only one friend actually knew, that I'd actually gone to the doctor, as a result of that. But that was a very high risk moment for me. Now, if I had been able to anticipate this, I would have had, it would have been a completely different, conversation that I would be having, here. And this is the point. I'm saying actually we can anticipate this stuff because this actually is kind of how the journey or the experience of this sort of unfolds. So the next big thing came for me actually was, I found my NLP response again and I modified it. So instead of just interrupting voices, I kind of said to them, you miserable so-and-sos, you're actually not who you say you are, okay? This was a complete surprise because you came along being, again, very threatening as God, and as God actually was at the stage, making all kinds of threats, which were really, and I say, an experienced in a terrifying way. So I said, bleep you, you'll be whoever I damn well say you are. And I say this is when I created the caricatures of my voices. I exaggerated their worst features. And of course, what this did was it made me more objective about them. It gave me a way to kind of recognize what they were doing. It gave me a way to kind of to minimize it. Even though I was exaggerating it in the caricature, at the same time, I was actually minimizing it because I could see it for what it was. I think that's really what was sort of going on there. And then I named them little names because I thought, if you miserable blimmin' so-and-sos, if you're going to give me a hard time, I'm just going to mock you to death, was my response. So of course, God became Squealy. The two other voices became Tutu and Poopsie. And of course, the other big thing that did for me was I had an instant response. I had one word that I could use to respond always. So even if I'm caught by surprise and my threat system is engaged, I can say, Squealy, bleep off. We're not gonna do that. And of course, I've since learned to spot the signs of getting there, but and of course that'll cover it in the my strategies as well. But this was a huge thing. This helped me. This was helping me own the transaction. This NLP response. This over here helped me own the relationship because it took away their power, and it was also me responding in anger. I kind of said, you can bleep off. You will be whatever I tell you you are. And of course, this is how I actually pushed through the fear. And I actually said to this miserable thing, if you are God and if you are an evil God as you claim, then I'm screwed anyway. We're all screwed. So what have I got to lose? Okay, so this was my approach to it in the end. And actually, it was the best thing I did, because I simply said, what's the worst you miserable things can do? You can, you know, make the phenomenology so bad that it's intolerable. This miserable little so-and-so here called Poopsie has kept me awake for 5 days at about this time, which was absolutely awful. And I just kept saying, the worst that can happen is I'll land up in the emergency room. I get my doctor there, they'll lock me out for 2 days. I said, and then what are you going to do, Poopsie? And of course, you know, from then on, you know, I owned the relationship. So this was owning the response, owning the relationship. And those of course, were big steps that created the space for me in which I was then able to actually dive into this thing and sort of withdraw and dive into it and withdraw. Because every time I picked the stuff up, every time I picked up my notepad to make notes, I've got 5,000 pages of notes, literally. And those are the ones I've kept as opposed to the ones I've thrown away. You know, that created this sort of space of objectivity where I, you know, played with these voices, and I conducted, to say, these thought experiments, you know, where I was then sort of testing, pushing, prodding, and of course learning more about myself and the mind at the same time. So May 2015, I came up with the first model, which now looks like this. My story model is that it was a, you know, I've got progressed over a year, you know, to get to this, but basically I came up with these sort of 5 themes here, more or less, fairly early on, and I connected mind and body, you know, sort of later on. And of course, this completely changed my perception, my understanding of voices, and of course, but also my perception of the experience of them. And as I say, you know, there were 2 things for me here that, you know, that I kind of struggled with. One was that I actually realized that really, you know, these things are so miserable. They're presenting this catch-22, and from that, there is no good outcome. You know, at best you can minimize harm, you know, and that really angers me. You know, I mean, I say not just that, you know, not that it didn't just make me angry, it angered me. You know, so I was left with this lingering anger. So every time voices prodded me, I was, you know, more this. What the bleep do you think you're actually doing? And of course, eventually I found a way to manage the anger. That was actually quite, you know, quite a difficult piece. And I reckon actually that anger, of course, is much better than fear and paranoia. Of course, I was directing my anger at voices, at least in the sense of, you know, sort of aiming my thoughts, if you like, at them. And if it became too much, I could get up and yell, scream, you know, or walk outside and yell and scream, but it wasn't disturbing my neighbors. But I say, at least, you know, anger is something, you know, that is easy to manage, and it's putting you in your drive system rather than having you in your threat system. So this is still getting through the fear and paranoia. It was my anger that made me say to these guys, what the bleep do you think you're doing? If you're an evil god, I'm screwed anyway. We all are. So there's nothing I can do about it. So get on with it, you know, was my approach. And of course, they still proceeded to try and make the experience particularly bad. But of course, you know, in time, you recognize that their threats are actually hollow, empty threats. That actually the problem with them is the experience of them, because the experience is awful. You anticipate them. And of course, you know, all the worrying about what they can do is actually just getting in the way of you doing what you want to do. And so it took me a while to kind of get there. I'm hoping that if others see this whole thing, they get there a lot quicker, of course, than I do. And of course, the other thing with this, of course, this for me is the depression risk. You know, this is not stuff I want to live with. I don't want to live with the fact that actually voices are getting in the way of my life outcomes all the time. For me, it's actually, you know, past the point of it's redirected what I do. I wouldn't be doing this work. I'd be working as a management consultant. So it's completely redirected my life. You know, and as of course I progressed, I found ways to use my management consulting skills, you know, in this, you know, in the space. So I managed to get it to the point where at least I'm enjoying some of it. But you know, but overall, as I say, you know, it's definitely knocked my quality of life. It still irritates me no end. That voices bother me when I go to bed at night. They wake me up in the middle of the night, disturb my sleep. It bothers me when I'm taking a walk, walking the dogs, for example. I've got voices badgering me. It's an irritation. It's not, you know, meaningful in that sense. It's not getting in the way of my sort of purpose in life, but it's an irritation. It's occupying the mind at times when I'm actually trying to have fun. And that for me is still, although it's an irritation, it's this intellectually, I know that this thing is getting in the way of my life, and that irritates me and annoys me. And of course, I can ignore it for most of the week, and then somewhere once in the week I'll just say, oh, fly away voices. And of course, say that's the piece you learn to manage the anger, because I decided I didn't want to be an angry old man. I object to the idea that I had to decide not to be an angry old man, because I actually used to be, the most patient and placid person around. So of course, as I discovered one model, I actually then realized I had something, so I had a response, I had a way to push back on the kind of beliefs and reduce the intensity. And I had a way to describe, how we're actually giving meaning to it. And of course, this is when I started, by this stage now, I was going to Hearing Voices meetings. That was actually prompted me to go to Hearing Voices meetings, and I started going to conferences and approaching academics. And I had sort of conversations. And of course, I realized actually that the best way to make a difference was, to actually work with researchers. And I kind of developed, to say, these other models. So the model of kind of perception that you've seen, and I say there's a lot more to this, the model of our emotional systems and the relationship between information and emotion, which we'll see in other things. This was me, trying to appeal now, as I say, here it was to voice hearers, then it was to mental health professionals, and then to researchers. And of course, I changed, what I was actually doing. And of course, what I found, of course, is that I'm this crazy engineer, trying to make headway in this space. And I've got some good conversations and some really good references from some academics and some professionals in the field. I still haven't actually managed to find a research group to work with. So of course, what I'm doing is I'm putting all this stuff up on YouTube, so I can say to my voices, bleep off, the bulk of the work is actually out there. And I will find a research organization to work with. So two things to look at here. So the stuff above the line is my story. So this was unique to me. This stuff down here, though, I think is stuff, we have voices for getting in the way. This is stuff that I think pretty much everybody who experiences voices will experience in some way or another. I haven't really, I should say here, in these episodes, of course, I did actually experience, enough fear and paranoia to book into a hotel for 6 weeks, to call friends in a panic, for, my brother and my sister-in-law to come, one from Durban, one from Cape Town, Johannesburg rather, to fetch me in Cape Town, what have you. So there's the fear and paranoia, in these sort of episodes here. The other one, I say, is the mania. I spent lots of time where voices, were encouraging me. And of course, what that was doing was stealing mind share, leading me down dead ends, wasted, all this time, voices patting me on the back and encouraging me and saying, oh, how cute you are, how smart you are, smartest man in the world, most important man in the world, all that nonsense. But of course, what it's doing is your brain is recognizing it, and it's stimulating your reward signals, and you're going into this manic phase. And of course, what it's doing is pleasant for a short period, or even for a long period, weeks, but it's not building the story. It's not actually helping you live the kind of life you would ordinarily, kind of lead. So what I'm saying is, this lineup here is something that would be, unique to the individual. For me, I made voices my life. Of course, what I'm hoping, of course, is that others will recognize, having learned all the stuff they can learn from others, use this stuff to kind of say, I'm not going to let voices rule my life, and focus on, the My Story model to say, what kind of life do I want to lead? And of course, then recognize that actually, if voices are pestering you and have been for a long time, you're liable to go through this kind of journey. And of course, some of these are sort of low points. And then let's find, what are the high points in your life, that you have to sort of compensate for them. And of course, I also apply, sort of mind strategies to help me manage the transactions. So when I step back, for me, is the piece that really, as I say, angers me, is I look at this and I say, this experience, what a waste of mind share time. Yes, great. I've done some, I think pretty good stuff in terms of understanding this. Great. It's not stuff that I actually would have set out to do. It's not stuff, obviously, if I hadn't heard voices, I would never have got to it. And of course, as I say, it still redirected my life, because I found the experience so vile. And as I say, I kept looking at the idea that there are 300 million people experiencing it that don't know what to do. That are experiencing this kind of thing. This actually finding help is incredibly difficult. So I'm saying what we can do is we can use this kind of model. I obviously would like to work with with researchers to improve this. But the idea is understand this journey. I've got a pretty good idea of what it's like improve it. But the point is to anticipate the journey and to provide people with the right information and the right support along the way. And of course, the other one is to actually offer people strategies that we can apply in the mind. This no response. So how this NLP response, this minimizing the voices as opposed to letting them intensify your experience. You can minimize the intensity of the experience. And of course, what this is doing is building confidence. So this is working on your interpretations in the mind, but more importantly, building your emotional systems to build confidence. And of course, this is actually helping you, get your story back on track. So those are the main sort of learnings actually from this thing. The one is that actually the two things are working together. So it's actually, I've described it, where it's a problem with voices as the intensity of the experience. So in ordinary life, this is the quality of the experiences that we're having, of course, and of course, intensity is a part of the quality. So I'm saying that actually the quality of our experiences and sort of how they progress, so how one experience leads to another. This is our reward signals kicking in. But actually, these two axes are the things that really matter, that voices are getting in the way with. So what they're doing is they're disrupting the quality and giving us intense, unpleasant experiences. And of course, that's one thing that's wiring the brain. The other thing is, what would ordinarily be satisfying my reward progression would be my story, how I'm building my story, how I'm becoming a more interesting person, how I'm doing stuff that builds a career or a home, or whatever life it is I've chosen. And that actually what we need to be doing is looking at our rewards, in terms of our stories. So, I could say I am. I detest saying, I'm a voice hearer. I say I'm a business strategist and a voice hearer. I actually don't like adding that piece. Of course, it's relevant in terms of the work that I'm doing. For me, it's not an experience that I want sort of acknowledged or normalized. For me, it's something that's just got in the way. And of course, I want to help other people get on with loving the life that they lead. So I call it Love Life, laughing out loud. So in the mind strategies, I will kind of show us how to use mindfulness, referencing this kind of framework to actually displace voices. And of course, the second thing to do is that recognize that. So this is our interpretation of it and the outcomes that we're achieving. The other thing, of course, is to manage the transactions. And the importance of managing the transactions is actually that this is how you're building up your emotional systems, your emotional strength, your resilience. And of course, what you're trying to do is, if you can create positive transactions, what you're doing is actually building your self-assuredness. So I mentioned that this experience had very much knocked my self-confidence, not so much my concept of self, but because voices were undermining what I was trying to do. And what I was trying to do about building getting my life back on track, building a future. And of course, they were doing that by dominating up here, and they're kind of saying they have all the answers to the meaning of life, when they don't. In fact, they were trying to make the meaning of life, sort of awful. Those transactions were undermining my resilience and my confidence, and that was because they were undermining the transactions. And if you can own the transactions, you can actually build a sense of security, you can build a sense of optimism, and actually you can build a sense of confidence. And that's what you want to do. This is how you want to think of the emotional systems. You want to think that I have three, basically, and if I can actually, assert principles, to help me, live the kind of life I want to lead, and I use those same principles to react, in terms of how I react and respond to voices. Then actually, I will make them less important, and I will make, my ordinary story more significant. And this is the point you want to do, is by voices, imposing themselves up here as God, the devil, ancestors, aliens. They're trying to assert a level, a relationship of power over you. And what you want to do is bring the power back to your own ability to create the life that you actually want to live, and you want to give, put the significance to what you're doing to create the kind of life that you want. So once again, it's about the phenomenon. It's not about us as individuals. You're not mentally ill. It's this weird phenomenon that's arriving, throwing all this nonsense at you. And of course, what it's doing is it's actually disrupting your thinking, which is disrupting the way you live your life. It's actually interrupting what you're trying to do. It's certainly interrupting your thinking. It's replacing what you would ordinarily be thinking about, even though you might not know what you would otherwise have been doing. But remember that your mind is on all the time. If you're thinking about voices, that's time you could have been doing something else. So it's actually displacing you from your life. And what I'm saying, actually, you'll see in the mind strategies that this is exactly what I do to voices. I just flick it around. So by creating the caricatures and I'm disrupting them and their teams. As they throw something at me, I interrupt it. I replace it with something pleasant, and I put the focus mindfully, on my story. So I actually displace the significance they've asserted in my life, and that is how I, respond, to the phenomenology. And of course, the mind strategies are about practical ways to do this, that become a habit. So once again, thanks for listening to this video. I'd like to keep as much as possible all this material free for people who hear voices, since many can't afford it. To do that, I have this fundraiser on crowdrise.com called Someone You Know Hears Voices. If you're commenting on social media, please use #MadSense. If you're a researcher and would like to work together on developing all this experience mapping, all 3 videos that relate to it, that's how you can contact me, greg@mad-sense.com. And of course, as always, there are plenty of other important and valuable contributors in the space that would also welcome support. So please support whoever you can. Thank you for listening.